I'm T, and this is Suni. She is going to teach me about identifying plants.
So one thing that I think is really cool when we are learning about trees is to learn about different branch structures. So if you look at this branch structure right here, so we have a main branch here coming out, and you notice that these other twigs are coming out. And so when they come out and they are at different spots like this, we call that alternating, as opposed to a maple type it over here. You can see that there are terminations that are even. Oops, broke one off. But we've got these two here, these two here, and you can see this repeated in the larger branches as well, where the branches come out, and those are called opposite branching. So I always remember as opposite branching and alternate branching. So it's a good little trick for identifying plants. It's maple and ash are there are exceptions, but those are really the only two trees that have opposite branching. It's a reasonably rare thing that if you see opposite branching, you can be like, oh, it's a maple or an ash. So, for the fun of it. So, would you call this branch up here opposite or alternate branching? Thinking about opposite or alternate.
Alternate.
Yes. Great. So here on the ground, we have a couple of different leaves. This is pretty well known as oak. We have some maple. And let's get some of these beech leaves here. So looking at different leaves, we can of course see that they are totally different shapes. But there's some vocabulary that goes with describing these shapes. So an oak leaf, which we'll start with, these sections of the leaf that are kind of like little fingers sticking out, these are called lobes. So this plant has a lobed leaf. Now, the same is true for maple. Each of these sections are lobed, and so this is a lobe leaf. However, one of the main differences, aside from shape, between a maple and an oak, is that this edge is serrated and this edge is entire or smooth.
What kind of tree is this, Suni?
Well, this is a conifer, which means that it bears cones. And generally we think of them as just like softwood or pine tree. And a really cool trick to figuring out whether it's a red pine or a white pine, which are the two more common pine trees that we have around here, is to look on the ground. And we're going to find the pine needles that it's dropped. So if it's a white pine, it is W-H-I-T-E. It usually has 5 needles in a little pack, whereas from a red pine, which I don't really see around here, it's usually just 2. And I remember that as R-E, and it's not quite red, but it's a red pine. So white pine, you can remember, white has 5 letters and white pine has 5 needles. So have you ever had acorn flower?
No.
No? Okay, well you're definitely not going to get it at the grocery store, but you can make it yourself. So acorns are pretty recognizable. They're a little forest nut, and you can take that one, stomp on it. We'll see if we can break it open. Okay. So taking a look inside here, these guys have already been gotten into by little critters, but once you break the shell open, you can see that there's a good amount of meat in there. These ones are, of course, a little bit spoiled. Got little buggies in there having their feast before the cold months. But, so what you can do is once you get all the meat out, you're gonna grind it up and you put it into water and you're gonna soak it for about a week, and you wanna change the water every day until the water runs clean or clear. And the reason that you need to do that is because acorns have a ton of tannins in them and they are so bitter. They are just almost inedible. They're so bitter. And so the water, letting them soak, is going to leach all of the tannins out. And when it runs clear, it means that all the tannins are out. They're no longer visible because they give it sort of a reddish color. You can grind it into acorn flour, and acorn flour can be used to make really lovely little like acorn flour pancakes, and you can put honey on them. Kind of a nice little woodland treat.
Nice.
Yeah. Okay. So, T, what can you tell me about the bark on this tree as opposed to the bark on this tree? What are the big differences that you're seeing?
This tree has like, it's more loose.
More loose? Like flaky almost?
Yeah.
Yeah, what about the color?
It's darker.
Okay.
It's like brown. It's dark black. Dark
Try to
black.
peel one of those off. It won't hurt the tree. Just a little bit. We're going to check out the color underneath.
It's like reddish brown.
Yeah. So this is a cherry tree, and it is often defined as having very like burnt potato chip bark, and it's very identifiable in the woods. I think it's a really good first tree to learn because it has very like broken, peelable, burnt potato chip, snacky kind of bark, which is really cool as opposed to a tree like this, which doesn't involve snacking. Do you know what kind of tree this is over here?
No.
Okay, here, let's
What kind
take
of
a
tree
look.
is it?
This tree is an oak. Of course, while we still have leaves on the tree, that's a really nice indication with the oak because they have such well-known foliage. But another way to identify it is that it has similar bark in that you could see it easily being pulled, but it also has these long vertical cracks in it. They go pretty deep, and they make, from the distance, a pretty striking image of kind of like a cracked desert landscape. Can you see that? Mm-hmm. So this is oak. So maple trees have an overall much smoother bark, as you can see here. And they also tend to have a lot of little lichens growing on them. Little spots here and there. And we talked about earlier how they are opposite branching. So you can see that here, and then up and along the branches you can see that they're sending out branches in opposites. Maples also have these lovely little eyes on them where the branches have been either cut or have gotten sick and rotted away. Have you ever seen
What's a burl?
a burl? A burl is, have you ever seen on a pine tree where it sort of has like this big bubble of sap?
Yes.
So that's called a burl, and you can go up to it and sort of puncture it, and all the sap will come out, and you can make pitch glue out of it or resins. It's very handy. You can actually make, so pitch glue is made from the sap and a combination of a bunch of other materials off the landscape, including like rabbit poo, because it is super, super, super teeny tiny sawdust, and it works amazing for holding things together, which is silly and just sort of the magic of landscape sourced materials and making things with them. A striped maple. It's kind of a funky tree. As you can see, it is a pretty unique leaf shape for our area. It kind of looks like a tulip, and yet it is not a tulip tree. The tulip tree is different, but very similar, and so they are often confused for one another. But one of the distinctions that we can see on a striped maple is what gives it its name. You can see some really distinct striping in the bark here, and it's a very smooth bark. Can you see? Want to take a look? It's a good one to know, and it's a good one to learn because there aren't a lot of things that look like it in the woods. So we know that it's a maple from this opposite branching, and we know that it's a striped maple because it has this great striping and such a unique leaf shape. Here we have a plant that is called plantain, not the friable banana type thing, but plantain, and it is edible. It's usually better in the spring just because the leaves are fresh, they're a little bit more tender, more palatable. I would not suggest this for a delicacy at this time. But there are some really cool things that you can identify about it, which makes it a good first plant to learn. So when you break off a piece, you might notice that this vein, this sort of string sticks out, and it's because there are these veins along the back that have a really strong texture. They're kind of like the belly of a whale. And there's typically about 5. So we've got one in the middle and then 2 distinct ones on either side. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this plant, as I said, you can eat it, but it's also well known to help with bee stings. So if you get a bee sting, you can stop, pick a plantain leaf or 2, chew it up, and then stick it on the bee sting, and it's like magic. It's really impressive. Something about the natural constitution of the plant really helps take care of the antihistamines in the body. So you can see that it peels apart in like these long strings that were sticking out of its back. So if we were to compare it to a leaf like this, what do you see different about these 2 leaves? Other than obvious size.
It has, this one has like weaker veins.
Yeah, that's a really great way to put it. You can see that it has a pretty strong one going down the middle, but it doesn't have those flanks that the plantain does. What do you think about the leaf edge?
This one's more pointy.
Mm-hmm. This one has a lot of more of a smooth edge to it, which we call entire, and this one sort of has those serrated teeth.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead and touch both of them and let me know what you think about the different texture if you were to like munch them around a little bit.
This one's like tougher.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Which do you think would be more likely to withstand a frost?
This one?
I think that this one might withstand a frost a little bit better just because it has that hardiness to it. It's a little bit more rigid and tough, whereas this one has some really delicate, fine hairs to it that might be impacted by the freezing. Another way to identify plantain is you can see how it sits in the ground. When we have a bunch of leaves, these are just its seeds from this late season, but all of the leaves, you can see that they're starting in one spot in the ground and coming up out of the ground, as opposed to a tree. This is just a little tiny baby oak. You can see that this is a tree that's come up and then its leaves start on branches outside of the plant. Or this is cow vetch. You can see that it is a viney string and it has leaves all over it. So these are some other branching situations that can occur. So just like with the trees, you might want to say that this is an alternate branching because they're going 1, 2, 3, 4. And this would be called a basal rosette when all of the leaves are coming out of one main point, kind of like a head of lettuce. Here we have some sumac, which I always think look like little party flags this time of year with their little strings hanging down. These guys don't seem to have any fruit on them, but when they have those red fluffy tufts, they're staghorn sumac, and they're kind of like the stag horns. And you can actually make a really strong tea out of them. So you take the sumac horn, if you will, and you grind it up, and you get the little hairs off of all of the seeds, and it makes this really strong, steeped, tart sumac lemonade almost. It's very tasty, and that's sumac there. We're a little bit past when you would want to harvest sumac, but it is something to look forward to next August or so. So here we also have the infamous in this state Japanese knotwood. People often say that it looks like bamboo, and it does. If you want to come check it out. It has some very similar qualities to bamboo in that it sort of works in these little sections, and if we break it open, it is hollow inside. So folks often think that this is akin to bamboo, but in actuality it is not as stable as bamboo. So when this dries, it's going to crumble, as opposed to bamboo, when it dries it becomes a little bit more rigid. But it has this really fascinating, almost Seussical, like Dr. Seuss quality to the seed pods. They're like little 3-sided hearts, and they're kind of striped. So this always reminds me of like a lionfish. Have you seen those?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So imagine this in the ocean. This plant seems very tropical to me, as opposed to the quintessential like hardwood forests of Vermont. And I think in part that is because this is such an invasive species and should not be planted in your backyard.
Thank you, Sunni, for the walk through the woods.
Yeah, absolutely. It was great.